The second session of our lecture series on internationalism. The topic for today's session is transition to a multipolar world order.
Good evening. I'll start with answering of questions before I start this topic. Before I even take that up, I realize that not everyone's familiar with the world map and some of the countries I've talked about. Maybe it is useful if you could start looking at a continent every day to identify some of the countries which we have talked about. Especially if you talk about Central Asia. Understanding and knowledge of Central Asia is very, very limited. Though, of course, historically, there are a lot of interesting connections. So if you look at Uzbekistan, that's where Babur came from. Uzbekistan is also important because at Tashkent, the 1965 India-Pakistan conflict, the ceasefire agreement was signed at Tashkent. The mediation was by Alexei Kosygin of Soviet Union. So there are a lot of very interesting parallels in terms of history, also in terms of when you talk about ancient Indian history. I'm sure some of you are familiar with Kanishka, the Emperor Kanishka. And if any of you travel to Ladakh and go to Zanskar Valley, there is a Chotana Stupa which goes back to Kanishka's time. And Kanishka was from Central Asia. Okay. Some sources say China, but I will look at him as more from Central Asia. So a lot of are connected, but India somehow has not really paid much attention. This morning, I'm sure Abhishek sent you an article on Eurasia, how India should be concerned about countries of Eurasia, which is Central Asia, and countries like Azerbaijan. Again, Azerbaijan is also very interesting for us because there are a lot of connections of trade with India going back centuries. And even now, if you go to Azerbaijan, there is one temple which has a similar temple in near Kangra. The temple is called Jwalaji. And the one in Azerbaijan is called Bade Jwalaji. So this was something which is, again, ancient connection with Azerbaijan. But as I said, India has not really focused. A lot of us are not familiar with countries of Central. I would suggest you start with Central Asia. Also, I was reading a book on travel. It must be Madurai, it was Monday. And there, one of the chapters was on Uzbekistan. How, like Bangkok, a lot of people in North India go to Uzbekistan now for sex tourism, which is infamous, but again, for a lot of people, there is some kind of familiarity. And places like Kazakhstan, are important because, as I said, so much of natural gas and all of that. So we should spend some time knowing about these countries. I also talked about Africa, whether it's Kenya, Ethiopia, or Eritrea. The coastal part of Ethiopia became Eritrea in 1995, and it has close connections with India. If you go to Gir, Gujarat, in Junagadh, you'll find people who speak Gujarati but have very African features called Siddhis. So Siddhis were people who came from Ethiopia. If you go to Muru Janjira, about 50 kilometers from Alibag, you go to that fort. It was controlled by the Siddhis. Also, if you read Shivaji's history, Shivaji was almost trapped at Panhala Fort by Siddhi Johar. So in terms of, there's been a lot of connections with West Asia, Africa, and we need to rediscover. Some of you are thinking of doing civil service. So when you're talking about world politics in India, familiarity with maps is very important. For those of you studying for civil service, one book which is normally recommended for history and for journalists is a book by Basham called Wonder That Was India. There are a lot of interesting maps of ancient India, but looking at a lot of maps and familiarizing yourself with places like I mentioned Laos, I mentioned Vietnam, exactly where they are, it is important that you are able to look at it. So that's one part which I wanted to talk about yesterday. When we talked about the world, our familiarity to the world will have to be much better than what it is at the moment. Then let me look at the question. The first question is, do countries in the West deliberately destabilize countries in West Asia? I'm not sure whether the question is rightly framed. What do I mean by that? UK, France, USA have been interested in West Asia from the 19th century. And because of oil, also because in the 19th century the Suez Canal was built, and therefore they had an interest. And interest means they wanted to control trade, they wanted to control oil, so a lot of that, so there were active interference. But destabilization does not help any country. So therefore, whether deliberately they want to destabilize, I don't know whether it's correct. But their interference often leads to destabilization. Okay? So therefore, that is connected. Whether they want to destabilize is not the question. But a lot of the interferences cause destabilization. It has, like even if you look at Iran, okay, they supported a very unpopular regime of Shah, which led to the Iranian Revolution. Okay. Or the 2003 intervention in Iraq was disastrous for Iraq and for the region. For that was completely uncalled for. So there are some of these issues which we will need to maybe frame our questions and understanding a little better. That's one. Second, the question is on in terms of how does geopolitics affect United Nations and the Sustainable Development Goals. I want to make clear one important thing is that the United Nations is significant in some ways, but when it comes to really political issues, the UN is not really given a lot of importance. Even India, and a lot of its political choices have not really looked at UN. What do I mean by that? Most countries in the world are party to most UN convention. Convention is an international agreement. UN Convention on Human Rights. But when it comes to human rights abuses within the country, or we don't really allow the UN to investigate, or we really resist a lot of questioning because we don't think an outside party should intervene. Things like Sustainable Development Goals are more, from my point of view, on paper. I don't think they're very serious about Sustainable Development Goals. Why do I say that? Even if you look at, there is something called the United Nations Development Program. Every year comes from the World Development Report. The World Development Report looks at Quality of Life Index. Okay? And if you look at the Quality of Life Index, look at India's standing. For the past many years, we are in the last quarter of the countries, and therefore that is 120 plus. That's as this. So therefore, maybe our focus on economic development has meant not just us. A lot of countries have not really looked at Sustainable Development Goals. If you look at US, if you look at most countries in Europe, the environmental goals, a lot of that they've not given importance. Maybe some areas of health and others, other countries have given importance, but overall, Sustainable Development Goals are not really very important. And the question is, in the achievement of Sustainable Development Goals, what is the commitment of multinational companies? Private companies, multinational or Indian, are basically in the business for profit. And often a lot of CSR, they don't take it too seriously. Many of the projects they get into in terms of they have partners and all of that, I'm not sure how much of an impact it really has. Some countries like Unilever, which is an Anglo-Dutch conglomerate, I remember about in 2015, made a commitment that it will contribute to green sustainable goals under the chairman Polman. But I'm not sure how much of it has been really implemented. Or if you look at a company like Coca-Cola, if you remember, Coca-Cola had a major controversy in Kerala in northern Kerala, at a place called Prachimedu, where they were accused of drawing groundwater meant for farmers for the plant. And after that, Coca-Cola kept many $million for water conservation. Whether it is serious or whether it is what we call greenwash, we don't know. Yes, CSR could be used, but my own experience of CSR is it's very mixed. I'm not sure how really it has helped further. Countries could do better. If you look at foundations like the Bill Gates Foundation, there's also a lot of accusation about them siding with certain kind of pharmaceutical companies, pushing for vaccines where it may not be necessary. So a lot of it is very, what should I say, mixed. So you'll have to study it a little better so for us to have a better understanding of that. Also, the question is with the border conflict with China and should India move closer to the US? If you look at from 1991, India is slowly moving closer to US. And if you look at the 2007 Indo-nuclear deal, this was something which US signed with India in spite of India having done nuclear testing in 1998. And therefore, the relationship has been there, but on the ground, on other issues, there are a lot of differences. I also mentioned in my talk about this Quad, okay? Japan, US, Australia, and India as something. So that partnership is something which is there. And also does closer ties with US will be at the cost of Russia? Need not be. Even if you look at a country like Turkey, which is a part of North Atlantic Treaty Organization, has recently means last year bought some of the latest missiles, S-400 series from Russia. India is also buying from them. So for that relationship, I think will continue. But it could be much better. We don't really have the kind of close relationship with Russia as we have with Soviet Union. Maybe that's something which is worth exploring. Also, the whole question of in terms of the Uyghur Muslims, will it affect China's? See, in the long run, most countries do not really support human rights issues very much. If you look at China, in the 1950s and 60s, there were a lot of concerns about human rights abuses in Tibet. And even now, if you go to some parts of India, there are people who are promoting the idea of free Tibet. So we're talking about now, nearly half a century of control. Of course, what's happening with the Uyghur Muslims is something which is quite, harsh. Many of them in concentration camps. But a lot of countries will not raise these issues because they could raise questions about, if you look at the US, the way it is treated as Native Americans, Australia, the Aborigines even now. Or if you look at India, whether it's Kashmir or Dalits, or I'm sure some of you are familiar with what happened in Tamil Nadu a few days ago, where 2 people were beaten to death for a very minor infraction. So the whole issue of Uyghur Muslims will really affect China's position. It's not clear, though, since a lot of Central Asian countries to which China is using its BRI, they are Muslim nations. And some of them will be concerned whether it affect trade in the long economic connection in the long run. We don't know, but how serious we don't know. Also, in terms of what about Chinese impact on West Asia, given the fact that US and others already have a presence? Yes. One of the reasons why China is heavily investing is because over a period of time it hopes to replace US as an influence or major influence there. And therefore, that's one of the reasons why it's investing heavily, not just in West Asia. I talked to you about Greenland, where they wanted to fund airports, which finally Greenland decided not to go ahead with. But those are issues, yes, there will be that competition. At the moment, China and its companies seem to have far more money than anybody else. So therefore, it could change equations in the long run. Okay. See, there's a question on this whole issue of banning Chinese products to stop China dominating Indian markets. And even after the session with one of the former students, there was this conversation about how China indulges in breach of data security and all of that. And therefore, shouldn't we not allow them? My question is, how many of us even thought about it till June 15th? It was not an issue. It was a non-issue for most of us. The fact that the four Chinese mobile brands control 40% of, 60% of the smartphone market in India. Now, that will mean that they are providing products which are value for money. And in the whole process of penetration of smartphones in terms of cheap and good quality smartphones. So they've been there, and they will be there because they are products which, and India has a trade relations which India will need to continue for a variety of reasons. So therefore, we need to look at slightly a long-term issue than just the border issue. This border issue has been there since 1962 or maybe even before that. And we can still have economic relations in spite of the fact that the border issue is not resolved. Somebody asked a question in terms of should we escalate the issue and so that China will finally settle borders? I'm not sure what we mean by escalating. Are we in a fight, a war with China? We are not. Okay. Let's look at the economic and military difference. It is, it will hurt both economies. It may hurt the Indian economy more because of the slowdown and whatever else. So war is not really an option. And, I've told you I've traveled Arunachal Pradesh to this place called Kibutu. So when you go there, the roads are very narrow. Only one vehicle can go at a time. So the driver of the taxi was an ex-army man and was served in that area. He said the reason why the army is there because they said that if the Chinese forces come in huge strength, he said the Indian forces will be forced to move back. So they don't want to have very broad roads so the Chinese can travel faster. I don't know how right that kind of argument is, but there is a concern that if there is a war, a lot of our eastern borders are, the East Arunachal and all is the logistics are not very easy. It's very far, and so it could be difficult for India. So escalating does not help. Minor escalation, like in Doklam, we escalated and made sure that status quo is maintained. But beyond that, even in 1960, the Indian Army felt like they could force. And when there was a full-fledged war, the Indian Army crumbled in many places, especially in the northeast frontier, Arunachal Pradesh area. So therefore, that's something which you need to look at. Also, there is, this year, anniversary of somebody called Brigadier John Dalvi. Anybody in this group familiar with Brigadier John Dalvi? He was an army officer who was captured by the Chinese when his brigade was overrun in the 1962 war. And he was a prisoner of war for 3 months. So when he came, the Indian Army was concerned whether the Indian soldiers had been brainwashed. And he felt that he was not treated with respect. And he's written a book called Himalayan Blunder. The reasons for his analysis of what went wrong politically and militarily, because our soldiers had weapons which were, World War II vintage. Clothing was not enough because the war was in October, November, winter. Okay, and the war, if you go to Arunachal Pradesh towards Tawang, you cross this pass called Sela Pass. Sela Pass is 13,500. And sometimes even in summer, I remember in 2005 in summer, the entire Sela Pass was filled with snow. So imagine winter. So a lot of our, so therefore that book, those of you in Wilson College, I think we should have a copy of that in the library, Himalayan Blunder by John Dalvi, Brigadier John Dalvi. So that's a book. So this year is I think So this year means what? 3rd July was his 100th birth anniversary. So online, if you check John Dalby, you'll get a lot of material on that. So escalation, I'm not sure whether it's a good idea for us to pursue. And this whole thing about reduce economic dependence on China, see, again, trade is not because of any kind of partiality. Trade is because in terms of cost for most Indian companies, they are the best. They are efficient. They seem to be value for money. And over a period of time, the quality of their products are improving. So if you look at this company called Haier, which I think today is the second largest white goods manufacturing company, this household appliances. So therefore, that's something. And also this question on the Nepal and China increase closeness, and how does it affect India? So there is, I think today, there is an article I've sent again on that. So please read the article because it looks at our own concerns, and of course, it can be really threatening to our national security if China has access to spaces within Nepal for whatever reasons. So we will need to resolve the border issues with Nepal in a better way. We need to have better communication because, as I said, 2015 onwards, but even much earlier also, in many parts of Nepal, there have been very strong anti-Indian feeling because we are seen as interfere with their political system and things like that many times, not just once, but many, many times. So those are questions which were asked. There was a question about books to read. I have sent it. Hello.
Sir, a small follow-up question, if you will.
Yeah.
Sir, Shubhankar here. Sir, Chinese have this policy of 2 steps forward and 1 step backward. So they have done this in most recently in Doklam. Sir, how long do you think that this is feasible for us, and what should be our step forward?
No, see, it's not just about 2 steps, 1 step backward, 2 steps forward. See, any country will try and get strategic advantage. Every country has to make sure that its military intelligence is very active, especially all across the border, and make sure that they preempt any kind of such initiatives in the future. So therefore, that's important. It's not just for China. Like even in Kargil, we are flat-footed because we vacated the and they occupied it, and we had to fight a war to dislodge them. So every country will try and preempt. Even if you look at Siachen Glacier was something which was not in Indian control in 1982. So all countries will try and secure that kind of advantage. Or even look at Tawang line, which we did not include Tawang in India. Tawang was still a part of because the administration was very lax. There was a Naga commissioner. He ensured that Tawang became a part of India. In Chinese maps, they show Tawang as South Tibet from Tawang. So there's not. It's only we need to make sure that our presence is active all across the border, and we're able to preempt any kind of such surprises. Yeah. Okay.
Thank you.
So as I said, the books which I mentioned, people who study for civil service believe that international politics by Haywood is useful for the mains for study for the paper international politics, which there's a copy of that in the department library in Wilson College, and also find the book Globalization of World Politics by that Boyle and Owen. I find it better, but as to people who have attempted UPSC believe that Haywood's book was better. So these are books which I think, and also Oxford has some very good books on national security, UN, Indian foreign policy. Many of them are there in the Wilson College the political science department library. So that is something which you can start looking at in case you need any kind of references. So, so that is the questions which were asked. So I will move to the next today's topic, which is on the idea of multipolarity. Before I start with the topic, I need to establish some common ground of understanding. When you look at world politics, okay, what are the factors which influence, okay, different international political processes? Okay. One is power. Second, possibly ideas, institutions, okay, which allow for better cooperation and common rules for all. The third, which affects international politics, is what we call international political economy. This whole issue of trade, economic strength, economic influence, they play a major role in deciding the direction of international politics. Then, of course, there will be what we call the international political structures. What is international political structures? The fact that the world is unequal. Okay? And therefore, it gives advantage to some countries. So there are theories on that. So there are a lot of ways in which we look at international politics. But when you talk about nation states, power is very important if a country or nation state, as I call it, is able to fulfill its, or is in a position to fulfill its political objectives. There was a very famous thinker of international politics in the 1950s. His name was Morgenthau, Morgenthau. He said, national interest is always expressed in terms of power. Okay. National interest is always expressed in terms of power. And he also said, if economics is the science of wealth, okay, politics is the science of power. So we need to understand the various bases of power and how power uses. Second, if you look at the modern world order, we have to go back to a time period, to a date called, to a treaty called Treaty of Westphalia, Westphalia. Westphalia. Now, Westphalia marks the beginning of what we call the modern nation state. And from 1648 to 1945, the world in some sense was multipolar. What do we mean by that? The world was defined by Europe, and European politics itself was defined by 5 or 6 countries of more or less equal power. Okay? And why was there multipolarity? Because countries did not want any one country to become too dominant, or what is called hegemonic. So to understand multipolarity, there is something called balance of power. What is balance of power? Power equations between more or less equal countries, with the use to make sure that everybody's advantage is taken care of. No one country dominates too much. Okay, so therefore, that's the background when you talk of multipolarity. So the idea of multipolarity was to 1945, but Second World War destroyed all the significant powers of Europe. Okay. Germany, Italy, France, England. Okay. These are the powers which were a very important part of the earlier multipolar world. The other country which was part of that was Russia, and then became Soviet Union. But after World War II, Soviet Union and US, with their allies, formed the dominant blocs, BLOCS. So we lived in what is called a bipolar world. a world which is dominated by two superpowers and their power blocks. So therefore, these power blocks were quite cohesive. I'll give you an example. In 1979 December, in Afghanistan. So US and Western countries had economic sanctions against Soviet Union. Not only that, for Soviet Union, the Moscow Olympics was something which was a major, was to showcase Soviet capacity. And all the Western countries boycotted it. So therefore, that was something. So when you say bipolar, the world was really divided into these two. And it was not just these two countries, but the other countries which were a part of this group. For Los Angeles Olympics was boycotted by the Soviet Union and some of their allies. So this is something which was what we call the bipolar. Bipolar world lasted from 1949 or 1945 till 88, 89. Okay. By 91, Soviet Union collapsed. And from 91 to 2010, many people said that it is what we call a unipolar world. There's only one superpower. And that one superpower in terms of, therefore, if you look at the 1991 Gulf War, okay, the US was able to make the UN pass a resolution asking US forces to intervene in Iraq. Okay. In Iraq for the first time. So all of these is very important to understand. For about 20 years, okay, there was one superpower, whether it's China or Russia, they didn't really object to any of US interventions in any part of the world. Okay, so that's something which is very important for us to know. 2007, 2008 and 2010, there were two major financial crises. And then US economy began to decline. And by that time, by 2005, Russia was becoming ascendant, surely on its oil resources. Russia has the world's largest oil and natural gas resources. So the economy is not doing well, but it has a legacy of scientific development as a part of the Cold War and superpower era. And therefore, Russia became an important player. And from 2015, Russia has been playing an important role in Syria. The current government in Syria is propped up by Russia. Libya, it is again important. In other parts, again, it is active. So therefore, and now, Russia, Iran are having joint exercises, naval exercises. China, Russia, and Iran have had joint naval exercises in the off the Gulf of Oman. So therefore, that is something which we need to understand about the re-emergence of Russia. But from 2011 or 12, China became the second largest economy and has been flexing its muscles. So therefore, the question is in terms of, are we really a multipolar world? Some people believe we are a non-polar world. In the sense, we don't have enough countries which have influence to collectively decide to make decisions. I've sent a few articles. Some of them are not, I think they're not being able to open Financial Times, but I've sent a few essays which are very good. Please read them because that'll help you understand some of the things which I'm talking today. So when you say bipolar world, that these two countries were the most powerful military power for military nation states. Like in 1969, Soviet Union and USA achieved what is called mutually assured destruction. You may have better acronym, better full form for MAD, but that means that enough firepower to destroy each other. And whichever country could do a nuclear second strike. Okay. By 2015, okay, US spending on defense was more than the next 15 countries put together. Okay. Even today, US Navy is bigger than the next 17 countries, including China, put together. So while we talk about what we call a multipolar world, in some sense it's very asymmetric. If it is truly multipolar world, countries should be more or less equal. Okay. So even if you look at India is projecting, a lot of us believe that we are an emerging superpower. See, we don't have what should we say? A blue water navy. Okay. What's a blue water navy? A navy which can fight battles in any part of the world without having to come back to base. Okay. If you look at in terms of our naval capacity, we have only one what we call aircraft carrier, and that aircraft carrier also we got it second-hand from Russia. It used to be called Admiral Gorshakov, what we call Vikramaditya. Okay. And of course, we are building something like a aircraft carrier at the Cochin shipyard, and maybe one similar one at the Mazgaon dock. But I don't think this will really match up. Also, for us to look at in terms of our economy, as I said, compared to China, it's very small. Compared to, see, what is the size of the US economy? One of the articles I've sent looks at the size of the economies of the world. The size of US economy is 19.8 trillion. What is 3% of 19.8 trillion? And what is 3% of 2.5 trillion? Or what is 3% of 11.9 trillion, which is Chinese, what should I say, GDP. So therefore, it's a world which is very asymmetric. Of course, we can talk about EU. But EU, after Brexit, and EU also, if you talk about the 28, 29 countries which are a part of it, except Germany, the others are not very strong. And some of them are good economy, but they're very small. Finland, Sweden are very small economies. So will EU be a significant power in itself? We don't know. Because there are countries like Greece, countries like Portugal, countries like Iceland. Many of these economies are doing very badly. Spain, Italy. So collectively, will there be a force? We don't. Similarly, we can talk about Brazil. They can talk about South Africa. But these, again, in terms of, don't have a reach beyond their immediate area. Like if you look at the African continent, South Africa is not significant in the whole of the African continent. Okay. So therefore, when you say a multipolar world, there should be sufficient countries which should be there. So the word non-polar world is a world which therefore is in a state of flux. And also maybe it is too soon for us to write off USA. Because it is still the world's largest economy, it's still the world's most powerful military power. And yes, there are a lot of mistakes and inconsistencies, but it's better for us to understand as a non-polar world. Yes, we must look at, therefore, what are the kind of equations which will emerge. Okay? Russia and China could possibly get together because both of them have confrontation with US. Russia, especially after its incursions into Ukraine and the Crimea region, US sanctions are there, and therefore Russia and China are finding. Okay. And West Asia, Russia is expanding its influence along with Iran. Okay. Iran is significant in West Asia, and therefore there will be a lot of these local, but globally, like when you say world politics in the 1960s or 1970s, you could clearly say it was a bipolar world. Okay. And if Soviet Union and US didn't cooperate, even agencies like the UN would become almost non-functional. Therefore, that's important for us to understand. I remember reading somewhere about a diplomat said in 1964. He said, When there's a dispute between two countries, the dispute disappears. Okay. When there's a dispute between a big country and a small country, the small country disappears. When there's a dispute between two big countries, the UN disappears. So that was the understanding, because the UN as a intergovernmental agency, it's not world government. Okay. It has some influence, but it's not really. And also, if you look at the UN itself, there is a separate topic tomorrow. There are a lot of issues which we'll need to address in terms of does UN need to be reordered. But this whole topic of multipolarity, on paper, I mean, the last essay I've sent is a student essay, which is talking about some kind of multipolarity. But the essay at some place is quite garbled. But I want you to read it, and we can have a conversation based on that. But when you say multipolarity in terms of these countries together must be able to effectively decide the direction of world politics. Like if you look at Europe in the 19th century, okay, when Napoleon was trying to become too powerful, okay, Germany and England got together and they defeated Napoleon. In the 20th century, when Germany was becoming too powerful, England and France got together, okay, to defeat Germany. So those kind of equations, there was enough clout for them to really, have influence in that. And also, if you look at World War II, Japan, economically and military, was very significant and powerful in 1939, 1942. It's very interesting when you go home, look at the map. Look at the islands above the main part of Japan. These are Japanese islands which are a part of Russian territory now. Okay. It's very interesting. Somewhere in May or June, declared war against Japan, 1945. And they occupied because a lot of research is happening in those islands in north of Japan. And also it's very interesting, Japan, Germany, US were all racing to develop the nuclear bomb and the atom bomb. Germany felt that it was not able to do it as fast. They're sending a lot of enriched uranium to Japan, which was captured en route in a submarine. So there are a lot of interesting stories there. Okay. So Japan now, its economy is still not thriving, but it's still the third largest economy. Germany is the fourth largest economy. So whether we are multipolar, open. Different scholars have different kinds of positions. So if you all can read the essays or you can ask questions, I will look at the answers. Yeah? So that broadly covers what I want to say. Maybe a lot more will be covered through question answers.
So, shall we start with the question and answer session? As of now, okay, there is a question from Parikshit. He asks, his question is, sir, if a multipolar world is operated that uses a multilateral user manual and may potentially lead to a fairer world order, but the fact that the US is overarching military power and its influence over the management of global affairs. But sir, don't you think this may lead all of us somewhere in the milieu towards rising conflicts, that the single interests or desires of a single state via the back door will again come into existence?
Well, see, it's not just, if you look at in terms of US, yes, US definitely. See, when you say multilateral rule book, if you look at World Trade Organization was created in 1994 to create a multilateral trade framework. And also, but if you look at these, when you go after the session, read up the Cancun summit, where it was stalled. So WTO itself, it's not just the US. A lot of European countries do not want to allow developing countries to have more influence. They want to be able to have greater economic influence in certain areas. So any economically powerful countries will do that. Country will do that. I said in South Asia, India is seen as trying to use its size to bully other people. So politics is international politics is finally competition for power. So therefore, that will happen. But to the extent that we are constantly able to negotiate and develop multilateral framework, to some extent there'll be fairness. And this conversation is not just now. When you go home, please check what is called the, when I think you're still in class, that's why I'm saying when you go home. After the lecture, please look at the Algiers conference in 1973. The Non-Aligned Conference Summit at Algiers of 1973. Okay, that's the first time where the non-aligned group of countries, there were 77 countries in 1973, they talked about something called a new international economic order. They talked about the need for a fair, just order. So it is not just now, see, it has been there. And at that time also, there was something called the North-South dialogue. Countries north of the equator were economically better off, and countries south of the equator economically worse off. Now that kind of classification is not there. But in terms of economic terms, whether it is China or South Korea, Taiwan, they will equally use their influence to that. The point of race is very, very necessary that we should have a multilateral rule book, but multilateral rule books work only when the other countries also have the negotiating capacity. And therefore, like India, can India become a $5 trillion economy in the next 3 years? But even if it becomes $5 trillion, but there's a huge gap between 5 trillion and 15 trillion or 20 trillion. Okay. So those gaps will have to be, covered, managed. So those are concerns.
Yeah. So the next question is from Stephanie. She asks, while we are moving towards a multipolar world, there seems to be a far-right authoritarian capitalism group emerging. Brazil, India, Turkey, UK, and US, etc. How are they going to influence the world order?
So first thing is, yes, if you look at a lot of authoritarian regimes, there are a lot of problems with domestic aggression. But internationally, authoritarian regimes could also be a part of negotiation which looks at mutual benefit. Okay. That's possible because if you look at a lot of dictatorships, even in the 70s and 80s or 90s, okay, they were a part of a lot of like WTO. Okay, more than half the members in 1994 were dictatorships. Yes, the fact that a lot of, if there are authoritarian trends across the world, and you mentioned Turkey and other things. Yeah. How it affects multilateralism will again depend, as I said. See, any kind of multipolar arrangement will depend on strengths of each country. How much of economic and military clout does a country have will depend on the GDP and a significant economic strength. Okay. If you look at Russia's GDP is smaller than India. But what's the advantage of Russia? It is huge. It earns so much of money from its oil and natural gas. And has a very strong defense industry. So other countries, their ability to use that. And I also suggest that my own understanding is we're not moving to a multipolar world yet. Because they're not significant centers of power yet. We can be able to negotiate on equal terms with a US or a China. That will take some time. So so we need to think a little more before we discuss this further. Yeah.
Sir, connecting question to that, it's from Stephanie itself. The role of global tech giants in engineering. Also, she wants to know the role of global tech giants in engineering this. With data as the new oil, what roles will they play in shaping the world order?
See, along with so data tech giants, of course, that whole area of cyberspace, digital data, etc., is still so unregulated. Okay? And tech giants attached to countries will definitely do their country's bidding. So whether it's China or Russia, they will interfere, they'll do a lot of things. So therefore, the tech giants will have a lot of scope. But more than the tech giants also, if you look at this whole military-industrial complex, the military-industrial complex has been always playing such a big role in ensuring that conflicts, I mean, that's what some of the political theorists say, that they have a big role in ensuring that conflicts are not resolved because they benefit from ongoing conflicts. So there will be 2 or 3 such groups which are the tech giants are the emerging ones. But to what extent they'll be able to play a role in the future independently, we don't know, because that will remain to be seen. But yes, not just, if you look at Africa, a lot of the explosion of Africa in the 70s was by huge mining conglomerates supported by their governments. Like if you look at Congo, which has been crisis, which was under Belgian rule, the mining companies have destroyed. They've had private armies, and there's been so much of issues. Or if you look at a country like Liberia, which is known for diamonds, there's a civil war and so much of violence. I'm sure some of you have seen the movie Blood Diamonds. That's based on that story of Liberia. So there is still a lot of it. I mean, we need to broaden our discussion to go beyond tech giants. Tech giants, yes, seem to be at the moment threatening because of the control over this and the role that various companies have played in the past. And often it's through governments. Okay, so therefore that's a scarier thing.
Yeah. Next question is from Rohit. You can unmute yourself and ask your question.
Hello, sir.
Yes, Rohit.
Sir, I just wanted to point out that the organizations like terrorist organizations like Boko Haram, they have been part of a lot of Western countries in whatever reasons they have been there. But are there any influential factors that they promote such kind of activities? So say some countries strategically promote such kind of activities within some of the targeted countries so that they could get a strategic advantage over it, such as oil or other resources like that. Is there a possibility of?
Okay, so just let me, I'm not sure whether Boko Haram is really a Western strategy, because Boko Haram is a radical Islamic movement in Mauritius, started in Nigeria. Whether it's destabilized, that we need to understand a little better. But if you look at Afghanistan, that when the Soviet forces were in Afghanistan, the fact that a lot of the funding of the various rebel groups, which are called the Mujahideen, was by the US. It's a lot of terror. I mean, so if you look at a lot of the modern terror organization, a lot of the funding was by the US to offset Soviet influence in Afghanistan. So even if you look at Osama bin Laden was also funded by US in Afghanistan when he was fighting against the Soviet forces. That is true. But more than Boko Haram, we should look at the IS, Islamic State. And the Islamic State had maybe what should I say, a lot of tacit influence because they had control over oil fields. So directly, whether they were sponsored or they were not really attacked, or they were used to destabilize countries like Syria. So a lot of that is possible. But to see whether they are really sponsored by the West, I'm not so sure, because I've seen sufficient evidence, but I have enough evidence of, I can see how a lot of countries tacitly means quietly supported us and other places. So that is possible. But yes, countries will support groups which are using violence if it furthers their foreign policy, and all countries do that. Okay. Yeah, even if you look at India has been supporting groups like Shanti Bahini, which are Chittagong Hills in Bangladesh.
Yes.
We're supporting groups in Balochistan. Okay. Engaged and funded armed LTT in Sri Lanka.
Yes.
Not sentimentally. Countries will do if they think it will give them a political advantage, they will do that. But proves that Boko Haram possibly a lot more complicated than just to see it as a Western sponsored thing, because the roots are in economic alienation, problem with. This is a very difficult country because Nigeria has Muslims, Christians, about 5 or 6 major ethnic groups. And in 1967, there was a battle for something called Biafra, where a part wanted to separate. But reading somewhere in 2010, somebody said, God must be a Nigerian, because how they remain together. Because it's so much of conflict because of a variety of their own ethnic and other reasons. Of course, oil, because British Petroleum have been accused, militant groups in some areas to crush tribal resistance. So it is very complicated. And about Boko Haram, I think I will need to know a little bit in terms of the direct connections. Boko Haram is more a radical thing, which is that part of the world. Yeah.
Sir, the next question is from
Yeah.
Noel.
Yes, sir. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
What are your views on the economic activity in Kashmir and Ladakh?
See, when you look at Kashmir and Ladakh, there are 2 or 3 things which I want to talk about. One is a belief that there will be economic development in Jammu and Kashmir because Article 370 has been removed. Only problematic argument. Why? Because see, there was no Article 370 in Jharkhand, Chhattisgarh, MP, Rajasthan. So, but these states, UP, these states are also not really developed. So to say that something blocked and now economic development will take place is problematic. One. Second, it could also alienation, especially in Kashmir Valley. Okay. It could be politically very big. If you're going to extract because the new domicile rules and all of that is difficult. If you take Ladakh, there's a lot of concern in Ladakh among significant civil society people that Indian companies, private companies could come and start extracting minerals. And Ladakh is a very fragile ecosystem because already with warming and reduction of snow, in many places water is becoming a problem in the drier months. Therefore, that is one concern. Or with 4 years ago, there was a cloud burst. So there are a lot of things. So those areas we'll need to be careful. I mean, look at any economic development to be meaningful should involve. They should be stakeholders. It should be employment for locals, and it should not be at the cost of the local community. And the Kashmir Valley is really complexly problematic. Okay? And if you look at the kind of alienation which is there in Kashmir, it is very high. And just not now. I remember in 2007, for the first time, I had taken students to Kashmir, and I remember went to Kashmir University. And the kind of anger which teachers and students had against the army and the government policies, a lot of our students are so shell-shocked to see that kind of anger. So, and so I said it's very complex. Says we can't disassociate economy from culture, politics, society. Yeah.
So the next question is from Shubhankar. He says he will require Chinese visa to visit Tibet. If majority of countries are wary of China, why only a handful of them recognize Tibet as a sovereign nation?
No, see, most countries have tacitly recognized Tibet. Okay. Very few countries officially make that an issue. And also, if you look at the kind of influence which China has, like a lot of countries now don't invite the Dalai Lama. Even Australia, when they invite the Dalai Lama, China immediately had some kind of unofficial economic sanctions. Okay, even if you look at Mongolia, so Mongolia invited the Dalai Lama for a visit, and earlier Mongolia would depend on Russia, Soviet Union, Russia. So this time when the Dalai Lama came, China just put a lot of economic sanctions. Then Mongolia had to apologize. And also very interesting when Narendra Modi had gone for he was the first Indian Prime Minister to visit Mongolia, Ulaanbaatar. He promised that India would help, but India was in no position to help them when China was imposing sanctions. So economic influence, I don't think most governments now today really actively support the idea of Tibet. In principle, they all think that Tibet and Dalai Lama and all should be should get back their power and rights. But actively, I don't think very few people. I mean, most people do. Yeah.
Next question is from Shrutika. She's asking, Sir, is NAM relevant today?
See, at one level, no. Okay. See, it's dead. Forget relevant. I think it's dead. But I just wanted to look. I just want to take you back a little in history because you need to understand. In 1988, the non-aligned movement was in Belgrade. The summit was in Belgrade. The first summit was in 1960. So 1988, when the summit was organized, the important question was, what should be the position of non-aligned movement now that Cold War is coming to an end? Okay. Unfortunately, the opportunity was not used. Because when the meeting was organized, the rule was that heads of government will speak for 5 minutes. Okay. And the rest of it will be serious discussion so that we can have some resolution. Unfortunately, all heads of department, including Indian Prime Minister Rajiv Gandhi, spoke for minimum 1 hour. So there was no time to discuss these issues. The second time they raised the issue was in 1993. The NAM summit was in Jakarta. At that time, they said that now that the WTO is coming, can NAM be transformed into a body representing the economic concerns of the developing countries? Again, countries like India, Narasimha Rao was the Prime Minister, didn't really participate because we were scared of offending US because we are hoping that we'll get a lot of economic and other support from US. So if NAM had kind of, what should I say, reinvented itself, there were two historic opportunities and both were wasted. And after that, I don't think NAM is relevant. And also in 1997, see, till 1986, all the NAM countries voted as a bloc in the United Nations. Okay, so if you look at something called the Law of the Sea, very important resolutions were passed because 90 to 100 countries will vote together. But in 1997, when India stood as for the non-permanent seat in the Security Council, okay, India lost to Japan because a lot of NAM countries did not vote for it. So in the sense of solidarity of NAM, the whole purpose of NAM itself is now obsolete. It's no longer relevant. Yeah.
The next question is from Vaidehi. She asks, Sir, could you kindly repeat what you said about the Chinese economy's relation with other Muslim countries in the wake of Uyghur Muslim situation?
Yeah. See, if you look at the Belt and Road Initiative, the Belt and Road Initiative has to pass through Central Asia because it's also wanting to connect East Asia, Southeast Asia with Europe. So at the moment, a lot of the initiative is to Central Asia. And Central Asia is Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Turkmenistan. Okay. And then if you go to Eurasia, it is Azerbaijan. All these are Muslim countries. And many of them are not very happy with the way the Muslims, the Uyghur Muslims have been treated. And they have started protesting. But it has not really affected the kind of economic relations. It could in the future. If they get support from elsewhere, then they may. But at the moment, there's no perceptible kind of protest or resistance which would force China to kind of step back a little. Okay. And as I said, all countries believe these kind of conflicts are internal issues. So if you say a country is sovereign, sovereign is independent, then no other country has any business to interfere. So that's the policy which all countries follow. And also, if you look at Central Asia itself, almost all the countries have dictatorships. And therefore, whether the people, whether if the democracy, maybe there'll be more people's voices, there'll be influences. So that doesn't happen. And most dictators don't really worry too much about issues like religion and solidarity. They're more concerned about things which will keep them in power.
Okay. Ashraf Ali has a question. The Alliance for Multilateralism, recently created by France and Germany, in face of US backing out, is a new chapter in finding a way for multilateralism to define international relations. India has signed up to it. However, US has been using its methods to undermine multilateralism itself. In such case, what is the role of civil society and citizens to push for it, or will we be at mercy of leaders?
See, when can civil society push for anything? When we are better informed. See, the question you asked about this, France and Germany and India also agreeing with that. How many people, see, even among your friends and classmates, ask how many people know. So if a lot of us don't know about these developments, how will we influence or put pressure? So being better read on the world international issues will possibly influence civil society to some extent. Okay. In some countries, civil society actively push for certain kind of, alliance, like in 2003, a lot of active groups in France and Spain which opposed the US intervention in Iraq. Okay. So the governments also will not take such a very strong stand if a lot of it, because they'll be worried about elections and things like that. So for, yes, there is need for civil society to be better informed and ensure that we all, because multilateralism is the only way forward for any kind of fair political order. And multilateralism sometimes works, sometimes hasn't worked. But WTO, at least for about nearly 15 years, worked decently. Now it's on ventilators, so I don't know what will happen to it.
Okay, so the next question is from Freyortis Satarawala.
Yeah.
The question is, today's German economy, so does European economy too, is in a weaker position. Can this be contributed to amount of resources spent by Germany and other European countries on Middle East immigrants? As you know, we see unemployment problems as native Europeans feel offended, social problems, and also the rise of neo-Nazism.
See, the rise of neo-Nazism precedes the immigrant issue. And also, if you read, all of you must definitely read Abhijit Banerjee and Esther Duflo's latest book. Because they've done a lot of work and they quote a lot of other economists who look at and say whether immigrants actually take away jobs. Jobs are not taken because immigrants take jobs which the local people don't want to take up. Okay, that's one. And there are a lot of other issues. So it's a very complicated. And Germany is not weakened because of the immigrant issue. Because Germany is not really, I don't think it's taken so many immigrants that will weaken, but it's because of the general slowdown, the recession in the world economy, problems with its own, some of its own industries. Also, if you look at France, the problem in terms of low labor productivity, there are a lot of concerns in France, Italy, Spain, Portugal about productivity. Okay. Greece has been having serious problems without the immigration issue. And Greece has had severe economic issues much before the whole immigration issue. So I don't think it's connected to that, because a lot of times this whole immigrant issue is overblown. If you look at what's the percentage of immigrants now? Even if you look at a country like France, which had colonies in North Africa, okay, and the population of people whose origins are North Africa is not more than about 10%. So therefore, this whole bogey that immigrants will flood the country and all that is not borne by evidence. And the rise of the right has preceded, whether it's in Austria or other countries, has preceded this crisis, right from, and it's been from 2011 or 12, we've been seeing the rise of neo-Nazis and radical right. Even in countries like Holland, the rise of the right has preceded immigrants. Yeah.
So we have many questions. So till what time can we continue?
Like I said, we'll go till 7.
7. Okay. Also, please, all the participants, please fill in the feedback forms. And there is also a link to the WhatsApp group. So you can get access to all the articles that Sir sends. The next question is from Harpreet. She asks, tensions have been increasing in the Western Asian countries after the Arab upspring. Experts also predict that multipolarity will cause instability in these regions, especially with nations like Iran and Saudi Arabia who are trying to fight for power. In the longer run, is multipolar system beneficial for global peace?
See, if it is a stable multipolar world, like there was a stable bipolar world, if you look at 1945 to 1988, there were no major battles between US and Soviet Union or whatever. So there was peace. There was, of course, disequilibrium because of interference, but that's a different thing. Also, when you're talking about Saudi Arabia and Iran, it's not so much multipolarity, but it's a regional balance of power question. Like if you look at South Asia, the conflict between Pakistan, India, China, etc., is more of a regional power issue. So, Iran, Saudi Arabia, flexing muscles and all of that is something which is part of a regional thing. And if multipolarity does not have the kind of economic and military muscle backing it, of course it will be very unstable. That's why I said we should not use the word multipolarity loosely, because in terms of the world, which 5 countries do you think are, or 6 countries or 10 countries you think are more or less equal? Okay. Saudi Arabia and Iran will not even consider there. Therefore, it's a local issue. Because their conflict, their power conflict is causing instability in Yemen, Libya, other places. Also, when you're talking about Arab Spring, I'm glad you mentioned Arab Spring, because Arab Spring is also a result of the fact that the West, communism, allowed a lot of dictators to rule when it was convenient to them. Okay. The West, in that sense, has been very hypocritical. In 2003, one of the reasons for attacking Iraq was they said that, we want to replace Saddam Hussein with a brutal dictator. But at the same time, there are a lot of other brutal dictators. So Arab Spring was against the fact that the political processes in North Africa and West Asia, okay, had kind of stagnated under one leader. And there were no economic benefits to the majority. And there were a lot of other issues. So therefore, that's the reason why the Arab Spring. Of course, the Arab also, in terms of when it happened, outside country forces intervened. Like in Syria, whether it was Russia or Western forces, they took sides, they funded all of that. So therefore, that worsened the issue. But multipolarity as is really defined, I think it's still a long way ahead. But unless it's backed by stable economic and military order, it will definitely cause more instability. But we need to understand local power equations, which are instability.
The next question is from Abhishek. With manufacturing of and access to bioweapons, drones, missiles, cyber weapons, and other such destructive technologies getting easier for non-state actors to procure, do you think the locus of power is shifting away from nation states and thus more difficult for intergovernmental agencies like the UN to regulate? What do you think?
Okay. This is a very important question which I should have looked at when I said the whole issue of discussing polarity itself. Because yes, there are a lot of non-state actors who could become very powerful, but the state is still very powerful in access to resources, which non-state actors cannot match. So if you look at the Islamic State, okay, at one time it threatened to become so powerful that it could destabilize many countries and maybe become important, but over a period of time, it just couldn't sustain itself. So when you talk about, yes, access to weapons by itself is not sufficient, because access to weapons can cause damage, okay? But in the long run, does not benefit anybody. Okay? So yes, they could cause wobbles, they could cause this, but non-state actors at the moment in terms of accessing, whether it is biological weapons or chemical weapons. Incidentally, in 1993, there has been a biological weapon, banning of biological weapons and chemical weapons. But most countries don't respect it. All countries still have secret arsenals, and a lot of wars these are used. Even in Syria, nerve gas was used. So that's a serious issue. Whether it will destabilize the world. And as I said, unless intergovernment agencies have military power or economic influence of their own, they can't be really overriding nation states. Because as I said, the UN is an intergovernment agency. Its jurisdiction or power ends where the jurisdiction or power of the nation state begins. Okay. That's very clear. So even if you look at the India-Pakistan conflict, India took the matter to the UN in 1948. And if you travel to Srinagar on the outskirts of, there's a UN office. Okay. But unless India agree to suggestions, resolutions, cannot do anything. And even in 1956, after the war ended in the Suez, and it was decided to send a UN peacekeeping force, Israel refused to let the peacekeeping force on its territory. So Egypt allowed it to be on its territory. So building in 1967, the first thing Egypt did was to ask the UN peacekeeping forces to leave. Okay. So the UN will have limited influence. Or if you look at what happened in the Balkans, that is Southeast Europe, when this country called Yugoslavia began to break up. Okay. So UN forces were quite ineffective in controlling. Finally, the NATO forces, they forced the countries to negotiation, and the Dayton Peace Accord happened, DAYTON. So intergovernment agency is going to have that clout. Of course, collective security agencies, if they manage it well, it could work. Before I go to the next question, I just want, there is a very good book called Goodbye Kabul. Something, please read that book. Okay, that book was written when US finally decided to withdraw from Afghanistan. Okay. And that book said that US, when it decided to get into Afghanistan, should have at least consulted the histories of UK and Soviet Union. Okay. I'm sure all of you remember the British government in India fought 3 Afghan wars. And the 3 Afghan wars were disasters for the British. Okay. Sometimes the entire army was decimated. And those of you who are in Mumbai, if you go to the Afghan church, okay, friends of the soldiers who died in the Afghan war. So therefore, in terms of when countries decide to intervene wherever with military or any other thing, if they read history, they'll understand why certain kind of interventions cannot work. You know, initially you may get advantage and you may be able to control large territory. But you can't control resistance. You can't control alienated populations. So, you know, in the when the Mujahideen were fighting the Soviet Union, they would, in the mountain, there were these tunnels, no? They would enter in one side and they would come out the other side. So therefore, they could not be defeated. So when the US came in, they came in with a bomb called the Daisy Cutter. Please check the Daisy Cutter. Its impact, it can bore into how many, 100 meters. in spite of the best weapons, Taliban still controls significant portions of Afghanistan. So we need to read history to avoid certain kind of choices, certain kind of interventions. Yeah. Sorry for the digression. Next question.
Yeah. The next question is from Sheldon. With media subservient to authoritarian governments and protests not possible in a time of corona, how does the average citizen get heard aside from voting?
See, that's why many of you are not there in the previous lecture. My suggestion is that if all of us MPs, when it starts, okay, write to newspaper. A lot of ways in which we can communicate, we can create communities of concern, okay, for transparency, better information. So that can be done. See, civil society has to figure out. And all of us can be innovative when we want to. So as groups of people who can think of innovative solutions, we can figure out how we can be more participative. Okay? So it is possible. Yes, the situation is possibly more adverse now, media is subservient, and the state has become more powerful. All that is true. But I'm sure there are ways in which we can figure a way out of this.
Yeah, the next question is from Utsari. Recently, psychological warfare is doing rounds in media. What do you think are the symptoms of psychological warfare, and is it restricted to economically or technologically advanced nations?
See, psychological warfare is basically the use of propaganda. And in terms of, you can find ways in which you can use psychological warfare. And therefore, right from the World War I onwards, governments have been using psychological warfare to justify war, to exaggerate victories, to underestimate defeats, and also in terms of raising a lot of issues in international forums. So psychological warfare can happen in many levels. Level of civil groups. You can do a lot of things to humiliate, to instill fear. So psychological warfare is used all the time, and it can be used in multiple ways. It's been used right from the 50s and 60s. Okay. And you can use it in different ways, And see, it's also psychological warfare is what is communication. I remember in 1991 when US was attempting to attack Iraq. Media said, will Iraq become the next Vietnam for US? Okay. Because Vietnam War, US was stuck for nearly 10 years and then it had to leave in a humiliating manner. Okay. And Saddam Hussein, in a lot of, through his communication, he said, if US attacks Iraq, it will face the mother of all wars. Okay. So you can use a lot of communication in different ways to suggest, to intimidate. Because psychological warfare, I'm sure, have all of you heard of this word called saber rattling? S-A-B-R-E, saber means knife. So people used to use knives at that time. So near the enemy camp, if 1,000 soldiers bang their knives together, swords together, imagine the racket. Okay? So the enemy can imagine that you are a much bigger army than what you actually are. Okay? So saber rattling can happen, like China can do on the border, Pakistan can do, India can do. Okay? So often if you look at, please read up Operation Brass Tacks. Okay? It's a major Indian Army exercise. There are many such, major army exercises near the border. That can also be a kind of psychological warfare.
The next question is from Satvik. What role did the CIA play in the disintegration of Soviet Union?
I don't know. Because the disintegration of Soviet Union in a certain sense happened because of a variety of reasons. If you look at the first three republics to separate from Soviet Union, they were Latvia, Estonia, and Lithuania, what are called the Baltic republics. And the Baltic republics themselves were annexed by or re-annexed by Soviet Union in 1939. Okay, so whether the CIA had a role, I don't know. I've not seen enough evidence. But in many other countries, the CIA has, like if you look at a country called Chile, 1973, when he was a pro-Marxist president elected, and the CIA joined with local groups to assassinate him. Okay. Then Chile went under military rule. So yes, the CIA has done a lot to undermine governments in a variety of ways. So therefore, there's enough evidence. So, but in Soviet Union, I'm not sure. Because what also happened in Soviet Union was by the Soviet economy had begun to stagnate by about 1975. And if you look at Soviet Union from 1979 to 1984, Soviet Union indulged in what is called foreign policy adventurism. What is foreign policy adventurism? That it intervened in Afghanistan, it intervened in Ethiopia, it also intervened in Angola, which is in Southwest Africa. And any kind of military intervention drains the economy. And in 1985, when Gorbachev came to power, the Soviet economy was nearly bankrupt. Okay. And of course, Gorbachev had his own set of mistakes. Then a coup overthrew him, then Boris Yeltsin helped him come back. So lots of complications.
One more question from Satwik. Is a unified Bangladesh-Pakistan-India union possible in the future?
I really doubt it. Why I doubt it? Because over a period of time, there's so much of venom on both sides. There's so much of lack of people-to-people connect, lack of leader-to-leader connect, especially between India and Pakistan. And so therefore, it will take years. I've seen there is so much of I've seen so many of us hate Pakistan. So how can we even have friendly relations? Forget a union. Let's have normal relations. Similarly, a lot of us have problems because we think that Bangladeshis are flooding our country and therefore illegal migrants, and we raise those kind of issues. So Bangladesh has a lot of issues with us, and we've not really treated them like equals. So whether such a union is possible, see, SAARC was supposed to create such a union. And if you look at the SAARC summit, I think Shimla summit of 1995, they're supposed to create something called SAPTA, South Asian Preferential Trade Agreement or Trade Area, which would have been similar to NAFTA or similar to European Union. But we didn't trust each other at all. No? And since then, things have become much, much worse. And politically also now, anybody who tries to become, will be accused of going soft on Pakistan, will be accused of going, disrespecting the sacrifice of our soldiers. There's so many things which now make it very difficult. So, yeah.
Sir, it's 6:59. Do you want to take one more question?
Sure.
Okay. So one more question from Noel. He asked, which type of a global relationship is preferred in the current world? Unipolar, bipolar, or multipolar?
See, ideally, if countries develop and there's a multipolar world, that's the best way to keep in check countries. But if you look at the bipolar world, there was an equilibrium for about 40 years. Okay. It had its negativity and all of that, but it kind of kept the world stable in spite of all kind of confrontation for about 40 years. The unipolar world had its, possibly, a lot of countries opened up to this whole liberalization. Economies grew much faster because they were all adopting Western-style capitalism. in spite of all the problems and weaknesses, there were some advantages. Now at the moment, it's in an area of flux. Unipolarity is the least preferred because one country can become too dominant, and the world is just too varied and diverse for any one country to decide what is best for all of us. So an ideal multipolarity, but that will take a lot of time. I don't think I'll see it in my lifetime. Maybe your lifetime you'll see it.
Sir, it's 7.
How many questions are left?
5 questions or so.
Is there any question which is very different from whatever last question I'll take, which has been very different from anything which has been asked? Yeah. You choose one question and I'll end with that.
Okay. Yeah, there is a question from Stephanie. Are we seeing the death of ideology in international relations, or have we always lived in politically expedient world? This is in context of the Cold War being a conflict of ideologies.
Yeah. Your question is in some way self-explanatory because I think my personal opinion is that very often ideology was basically for legitimacy. So we've always lived in a expedient and a world which is based on expedient. What is expediency? Doing what is convenient or comfortable. Ideology helped both Soviet Union and US legitimize a lot of their action. Like if you look at Soviet Union, the I think 1936 and 1977 Constitution actually talked about world socialism. So as a part of world socialism, they justified, there were other reasons for what they did in Eastern Europe, but they supported liberation, Soviet socialist movements elsewhere. Similarly, US also extended this whole idea of world safe for democracy. It was definitely more expediency, but ideology was possibly very much a part of public discourse. At the moment, I don't think ideology is really a part of public discourse. Though we use words like neoliberalism and this, I don't know what is it that they actually mean. Is there a clear differentiation? There's no alternative ideological perspective for domestic politics or things which are credible. Okay. Socialism, others may still have a lot of potential. But I don't think they're credible enough for people to look at it, at least among the political elites. So, it's always been politically expedient. Okay. That's why a lot of international political writers would say that ideology is a fig leaf of legitimacy. Okay. It's a very, thin kind of justification for a lot of things. So even when Truman said that US will intervene to protect free people, his free people meant non-communist regimes. It didn't mean democratic regimes. So as a part of the Cold War, US supported some of the worst kind of dictators, brutal dictators. So Soviet Union also supported dictators and groups which were at least officially aligned with its geopolitical strategy. Yeah, I think that's...
Sir, can we please take one more? Like it's the last question. I mistook the comments for questions.
Okay.
So,
yeah.
So it's a question from Rohit. Can we discuss more about sanctions, how exactly they are operated and how to counter them?
Okay. When you say economic sanctions, okay, there are many ways in which economic sanctions work. Okay. Sanctions could be because of a UN resolution. Okay. And sometimes the sanctions are made slightly light, so that it's not too harsh. So if you look at economic sanctions, if by the UN, the one which comes to mind is 1986. Okay. The UN passed sanctions against South Africa, so that South Africa would dismantle apartheid. Okay. And of course, South Africa found escape routes, other countries, third-party kind of thing. But these sanctions pinched. And by 1994, apartheid was dismantled. So sanctions can be done. I talked about, again, when you talk about, there can be very tough sanctions, there can be light sanctions. There can be overarching sanctions, and there can be limited sanctions. Like in 1979 December, when Soviet forces entered Afghanistan, okay, there's a complete blanket embargo and economic sanctions against Soviet Union. So all the existing projects were also stopped. Okay. Trade was stopped. Lots of things were just stopped. So that is one kind of sanction. There can be limited sanctions. So if you look at now against Russia, for the last 2-3 years, US and the West have put sanctions on a variety of projects. So what is Russia doing? Russia is therefore seeking ties with China, because China has economic wherewithal to help out. So even if you look at Iran, there have been economic sanctions which has affected Iran, but there are countries which Iran can trade with to escape it. But sanctions are always debilitating. It always damages the economy. And of course, sanctions are also again expedient. I don't know how many of you are familiar with something called the Contra Scandal, 1983. Okay. So when Reagan was president, the American Congress vetoed any kind of assistance to rebel groups in Nicaragua. But the government allowed a lot of US agents and others to buy oil from Iran, because at that time there was an embargo on Iran. And since that was not official transaction, that money was diverted to Contras. So there will be ways in which countries will try and avoid sanctions, but sanctions are always, it affects the poor more than anybody else. Okay? But it can have impact. Now in a world where countries are competing, maybe not as much. Yeah. Okay.
So we are done for the questions today.
Okay. Yeah. Just 1 minute before I go, I should have, maybe I'll announce it, say tomorrow. If there are any more questions, please put in the chat box. I will answer tomorrow. Okay.